Hi everyone, and welcome to the latest CTO Craft Bytes. Today we'll be discussing the symptoms, causes and remedies for burnout in technology leaders and their teams with Andy Skipper. If this is your first time at CTO Craft, let me tell you a little bit more about this group. CTO Craft is a mentoring and coaching community for technology leaders around the world, focusing on supporting technologists in their leadership growth. The community numbers are over 1,200 and provide one-to-one coaching, mentoring groups, an online community, and events like this one. So I'm Glyn, I'm the MC of this Byte session, and I'll be doing the fireside chat with Andy. I'm the CTO of Digital Solutions at iTechArt. Our speaker today is Andy Skipper, the chief coach and founder of CTO Craft, former CTO at Made.com and Comic Relief. Andy, could you give us a further introduction about yourself, please?
Hey, Glyn. Good to see you. So I'm the founder and the chief coach at CTO Craft, as Glyn says, and before that, I was CTO at a various number of startups, including Made.com and then at Comic Relief. And now I specialize in helping CTOs who are taking their first leadership steps and supporting them through their growth journey, essentially. Yeah.
Great to have you here, Andy, and thank you so much for creating the CTO Craft community. It's very useful for all of us. So we'll save time at the end for the audience to ask your own questions, but feel free to add your questions at any time with the Ask a Question button just below the video. So let's get started to discuss how to deal with burnout. So Andy, have you personally experienced burnout as a technology leader?
I have indeed, and that's what spurred my my real interest in it as a syndrome and as something that affects technology leaders in general. And it came about from my first CTO role, which was a startup that I joined as a developer, as I think most people start startups that end up being the CTO then. And essentially, it was quite an inexperienced leadership team. It was a very highly funded startup with lots of recognizable faces in the board, and so there was a lot of pressure. There was a lot of expectation on not just me but everyone in the leadership team, and I essentially became CTO there by default. There was no one else in the engineering team who had the capability of managing developers as well as managing upwards. And keeping the wheels on the bus, so to speak, and and essentially that became much more difficult as the team grew, and I eventually burnt out. I suffered what you would refer to scientifically as burnout, so it went beyond stress, it went beyond anxiety, and ended with the culmination of burnout, which is complete disengagement, and I left the company. So yes, that was my first experience with technology leadership and with burnout in one go. Yeah.
How many years had you been in technology professionally when you originally took on that CTO role, would you say?
So I'd been developing for about 7 years before that professionally, so commercially.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how long was that period of time from receiving that CTO role to the point where you felt that you'd burnt out from a time period perspective?
So I was there for 2.5 years, and I think probably just over 2 years of that was in the CTO role, so actually with the CTO title.
Okay, great. So then, could you discuss a little bit more about the symptoms that you experienced while going through this process?
Yeah, sure. So it started off with emotional stress and emotional burnout. So I became very, very down on myself and self-doubting. It felt like I wasn't able to get anything right in the role. I was making all the wrong decisions and so on. So that's how it started. And from there, it became physical stress and physical problems. So I was working 11, 12 hours a day. And not really looking after myself. I wasn't exercising, wasn't eating well, and so I became physically ill.
Okay, and was this over a long period of time, I'd assume, while you were working such long hours?
Yeah, probably over 9 months or so.
Okay, wow. And at what point did you realize that this was burnout and not just like normal daily stress or something that would pass?
So essentially when I became completely uninterested in the work. So when I joined the company, I was very, very conscientious, and I was probably too conscientious. We'll come to that. But essentially, was putting too much into it. But then, by the time I got to the point of complete burnout, I just lost interest altogether, and I became disengaged, and that, because I was in a leadership role, that spread down into my team, and they became disengaged and switched off. And that was the most obvious indicator to me.
Okay, great. And obviously you've had a lot of time to talk to other people, supporting them about going through their own experiences with burnout as well. What are the common patterns that you normally identify that lead to burnout that you've seen so far?
Yeah, so the most common pattern that I see in early stage companies is that they'll bring on a very, very good technologist as their head of tech, CTO, whatever they want to call it. The title is not really important. But essentially how they get to that level of leadership is by being a very good technologist. So they work their way up through junior, medium, senior, individual contribution. And then because they're the best technologists in the company, they get given the CTO role, or they get attracted to a startup because they know they'll get a C-level title or something very senior. And then they don't consciously make the decision to take on leadership roles and responsibilities, and they quite often ignore the fact that that's a completely different skill set. And also the founders of the startup and people around them in the leadership team ignore the fact that they haven't made a conscious decision around that as well. So they don't recognize the need for additional support in making that jump, because it's a completely different set of skills from developing and building software and architecting and so on.
Yeah.
And typically what happens is that they don't recognize the need to delegate. They expect they have to have the best skills technically to be in the CTO position. They take on all the hardest work, or they take on the work that protects the developers underneath them. And they make too many promises. They don't recognize that things can be turned down. They expect to be self-sufficient in the ability to diagnose and troubleshoot all these problems, but they can't. And then because they paint themselves into that corner, they start to lose their alliances in the leadership teams. Their relationships with the founders and the investors starts to break down, and then they eventually just stop caring, and then they lose faith in themselves. They lose faith in these startups that they're working with, and they wander off, and that's it. That's the end of it.
Sure. Yeah, I can definitely relate to that process. Essentially, as a developer, it's always about the race to the top. How can I progress faster, get into higher positions, more responsibility? And especially in a founded business where you are the one person that understands all parts of the system, you are the go-to guy for any issue, any support thing, and protecting your team below you is definitely something I've experienced as well, where you feel like you're looking after the team by taking on this responsibility and support, not delegating enough and supporting to them. So how would you recognize burnout in yourself?
So typically you start to feel it physically first. You feel the strain of having to work long hours, to being unable to manage your energy resources and your physical health in the way that you might want to. So you start to build up steam internally that you can't release, essentially. And then you start to feel things like cynicism. You start to wonder about the value of the work you're doing and the mission of the company and the point of it all, essentially. And that then leads to self-doubt and the questioning over whether you're in the right role, or whether people are talking about you behind your back and expressing negativity about what you're doing, and so on and so forth. And you become perfectionist, and you start to let things drop, essentially. And then you get emotionally exhausted as well. So you stop communicating with people in the right way. Your relationships outside of work start to break down. the whole thing. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, I've noticed that where under times of great stress, I stop seeing friends, I stop meeting people, and I'm just 100% focused on work, which is obviously what you mentioned there as a key sign, as one of the many key signs to watch out for. What about when you are worried about burnout in others? How can you recognize whether members of your team, be it peers or even people underneath you, are actually experiencing burnout? What should you be looking for in these cases?
Well, typically it's communication breakdowns. So essentially, they stop communicating when they're having trouble with things. They stop collaborating with other people in their teams, and when they're asked about that breakdown in communication, they don't engage, or they show that they're just not interested in solving those problems or any problems, and they are disengaged, they're demotivated, and they start to switch off. But you can also notice more obviously when they're taking more days off work. So if they're taking duvet days, or if they're stressed, or if they're starting to suffer from physical things like musculoskeletal pain and chronic headaches and things like that, that's generally a good sign that they're working through a lot of stress. But generally speaking, it's where they have decided that either consciously or not, that they just don't want to bother anymore.
Okay. Would increase in the number of hours that they're working be an indicator as well?
No, people tend not to overcompensate when they're burning out. Tend to overcompensate when they're stressed. So, you may have seen that earlier in the journey, but typically the pattern with people who are close to burnout or on the path to burning out is that they disengage rather than engage more, if that makes sense.
Okay. And from an outside view, an employee that's burning out will just be seen as a incompetent or an uninterested member in this case.
Yeah, more likely demotivated and not adding as much to the process and the team, essentially.
Okay, sure. Would you say that newer technology leaders are more likely to experience this, or do you still see this issue with more experienced technology leaders as well?
So it certainly happens with more experienced technology leaders in a startup environment. It's less so once a business has found its stride in a way and it's starting to scale properly and stride away. In the companies that are maybe Series A and starting to find their spots and their pace. Leaders coming into that, even if they have a lot of experience and have worked with much bigger organizations, bigger teams, quite often burn out in those startup situations. But it's certainly much more prevalent in early stage, kind of pre-seed to seed stage companies.
Okay, great. Okay, then. So how does this impact a company? So if a CTO, VP of engineering, or even like another senior member of the team is actually burning out due to work-related stress or actual burnout, what's the impact on the business normally?
Well, speaking about the effect it has on their team, which essentially is the ability to get products out of the door and ensure the quality, that all starts to drop, because essentially the pace and the tone and the culture of the engineering team is led from the top. So if your most senior technologist is burning out and switching off and starting to snap at people and to avoid meetings and so on and so forth, that does eventually filter down into the other people within the engineering team, and that causes a ripple effect on productivity and quality levels and general relationships between engineering and product, or engineering and the commercial parts of the business. And then thinking about their relationships upwards, it can affect the other departments in the company as well, because they don't have the ability to trust the engineering team because of the inability of the CTO or the VP of engineering to just have a general discourse with them. They avoid them, they miss meetings, they commonly push back on changes or unplanned work in a much more vigorous sense than they would usually. So it becomes much harder. And then further up the chain, from an investor and a board point of view and a founder point of view, they're usually unable to hit milestones and benchmarks in terms of revenue and growth and all that sort of thing, because of the fact that the engineering team can't function with a CTO in that state. So it has has an effect on them.
Sure. So it's really impactful for the long term of the business while that's ongoing.
Very much so. Yeah.
Okay, then. So how do you deal with it then, Andy?
Mm-hmm. So talking to people first and foremost. So as a technologist, I felt this myself, that I found it very, very difficult to admit to people that I was having trouble with burnout and stress. I felt that I should be completely self-sufficient. As a developer, I felt that I should be capable of coming up with a solution on my own. And that's why it lasted so long in my case. And it wasn't until I really started to suffer physically and was having to take time off work because of the physical problems that came with burnout that I really started to talk to people. And it started off with my girlfriend, and then it went from there to the founders of the company, who really, as we said before, really they just saw me as demotivated and demotivating. And that changed everything. They then give me people to speak to within the portfolio of the VCs that were better than the company. So I had a group of mentors, and I had a list of people that I could just talk to about the problems I was facing, about the role specifically. And then from there, I also got therapy. So I spent some time with a therapist talking about why I had fallen into that pattern, and found out that it was incredibly common, and it was a very simple thing to fall into if you don't spot the warning signs soon enough. And I also found out that it's very common in technologists as well. So I think knowing that, and knowing it wasn't just me and that I wasn't on my own, that made the biggest difference. But also beyond that, I started exercising more, and I took more holidays. I think there was one year when I was at that company where I took one day of holiday. And so, I actually made sure that I took the time away to reset regularly. And that made a big difference. And then from there, lots of small things, so I made changes to my work day. I started to defrag my day. So I would log all the work that I'd had to do, and all the context switching I'd had to do, and all the responsibilities that I'd had, and I'd defrag them. I'd chunk them up into an hour of people-related stuff, an hour of process-related stuff, and then a day of one-to-ones. And that lack of context switching, or reduced context switching, probably a better way of saying it, really helped a lot. The context switching had been a big problem for me. And yeah, apart from that, just being more pragmatic about what I was capable of doing. Before that, because I hadn't had a point of reference, I'd never worked under a CTO or a good leader, being blunt, before that. So I hadn't really seen what a leader should be doing, or the kind of output should be coming from a leader. And so I just kind of tried to do everything, and tried to do everything perfectly. So I just became more pragmatic about what I could achieve with my time and what should be expected of me. And I helped the founders in the company understand that as well, and they were open to that. And yeah, gradually it got better.
Sure. I mean, the time logging thing you mentioned, I think is really interesting, because I do that as well when I find myself under stress, where I go for an entire week. I've been incredibly busy in that week, but I look back at it and go, what have I done? What have I achieved? How have I helped? And you just forget about those things that you do. So therefore, by doing the time log, you can look back and actually see the impact, which for me gives me a lift of, at least I've been doing something productive during that week. The therapy piece is also very interesting. I think the connotations of therapy were in the past very negative, by having to go to therapy, you're crazy, or that type of thing. I think we've nicely moved away from that, and it's starting to become much more acceptable and normal to talk about these problems, especially with the way that society is now, where we're not as family orientated or as close as I think society used to be. So you were saying that you found that really useful for you. I mean, essentially, did you think the therapy part was more beneficial over the mentoring aspects, or the other way around?
I think pretty much equal, to be honest. I don't think I would have been able to make the changes that I eventually made without both of them in equal measure. One told me more about me at a personal level and a psychological level about why these things were happening, why I was allowing myself to fall into these patterns. But the mentoring told me that many other people had suffered the same thing, had been through the same self-doubt and so on, and had pulled themselves back in similar ways. So yeah, I'd say both.
Okay, great. So we've got a couple of questions from the audience already, so we'll jump onto those. So from Gavin, do you have any advice for someone who struggles with the delegation of tasks to others? I know I have definitely struggled with that in the past, and I think I still do a little bit now. What would be your advice for this?
It's an interesting one without knowing the context and the types of people they have on the team. So really, there are some teams that that I've come across where there are certainly some tasks that you can't delegate. But I think maybe if you were to track your tasks from week to week, or even just as a test for 1 week, and look at the ones that really require your input, and then take those and say, well, who is there within the team that can pick up some of these? If there's no one in the team that you trust to pick up some of those, which can sometimes be the case because you've been constrained budget-wise, you don't have senior enough people, or they haven't been at the company long enough, then you can take it easily. You can give them small things to begin with. You can work with them in one-to-ones to figure out what is and what isn't achievable. But it has to be prioritized. It doesn't happen organically, especially if you've been doing everything for a long time. You have to really put some effort into it. But iterate on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, only delegating at times of stress or like pressure isn't great, because you feel like you can't delegate in those cases. By trying to delegate earlier, and therefore you've built up that confidence early before you actually desperately need to delegate, I think is really useful for me. And normally for me, I try to delegate as much as possible. Every time I'm in a job, it's like, right, how can I get myself out of a job by giving everyone else my workload? And obviously, as you say, there's certain things which you can't hand over, but everything else that you can do, at least it gives them the experience to build themselves up as well and be ready to take over that responsibility. Another question from the audience: how do you avoid / delay making difficult decisions that are time relevant while you're experiencing a burnout? Do you alert your directors or colleagues?
Yeah, ideally would have alerted them way before this kind of thing came up. At the worst situation a team or a founder or a startup can be in is that they have a sudden, massively urgent requirement, and then you tell them that you're not able to commit to it and achieve it because you're burning out. But if you are in that position, I think all you can do is be completely open and honest with them. And then you can work with them to find someone to delegate it to, or to figure out some delaying strategy, or reprioritizing some of the other stuff, or finding help to take some of the workload off you in some other way. But ideally, it wouldn't get to that point before you've spoken to them.
Sure. I mean, some of the businesses I talk to, they have P1 issues almost every day or every other day. So in a situation like that, it could come on quite quickly. And in environments like that, I think it's very hard to get yourself out of that loop without some form of external support, or at least funding to be able to bring in people to help take over some of this responsibility.
Yeah, that's it. And importantly as well, if the rest of the organization doesn't know that you're struggling, they're not going to know that they need to make that budget available, or that level of resource available. So all the more reason to be open. Okay,
so just on that, before we get on to the next question that's been asked, how do you go to your CEO and say that you're experiencing burnout? So I think the tech industry is very sensitive to each other, and they understand it's lonely. And we're finally in that position where that support level is there internally, but amongst other CTOs. CEOs, first-time CEOs especially, they don't understand this. They haven't had to go through this or deal with people before. How would you go about raising this with them?
Yeah, it's not always the CEOs that you should go to with this. In the case where you have founders who are quite inexperienced themselves, and especially coming from some of the more established industries, I've seen they care less about this stuff, and they're less interested. And in those cases, I've suggested that people speak to people in their first team, i.e., the heads of the other departments, and find alliances in that team of department leads first, and make them aware, because at the end of the day, they are the ones that you're going to be dealing with the most about this stuff. And then from there, take a considered approach as to speaking to the founder or the CEO. In some cases, speaking to the investors. I've seen that be successful in the past as well.
Is it your responsibility as a technical leader to tell your CEO when this has been identified in yourself?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. They can't guess for you. Yeah.
Okay, so that conversation must be had at some point. So it may not be the first conversation, but you should definitely get to that at some stage.
Yeah, you really need to. You really need to, which is very tough, especially for technologists. We shy away from that stuff in general, but it is important.
Okay, great. Okay, so a question from Paul. I've always struggled a little to separate personal life and work life, but this has become a lot harder over the last 2 months while working at home. Do others find this? Any particular thoughts or suggestions for dealing with burnout under lockdown?
Yeah, it's so tough. I'm struggling with this at the moment myself. We're homeschooling and we're sharing the same space, and we're trying to prioritize and share times. My other half works part-time, and I'm getting involved with that as well. So yeah, it is very tough. It is very tough. And I think I'd suggest that people pay attention not just to their own energy levels, but to their partners, if they have partners, and to their children's, but it is very tough. There's no simple answer to it. It's affecting everyone very, very negatively and in a very intense way. Yeah, I wish I had a better answer. I'm afraid I don't.
Yeah, I mean, going from the other point of view, for my experience, I don't have children. I've got a budgie, which is a pet in a cage, so therefore I don't have dogs or cats running around me. So I'm in a lot exactly. And for me, the first 2 weeks were quite difficult. I've always been on site, even if I've allowed remote working within my teams. I've always been on site because I felt like I needed to be there. The first 2 weeks I felt quite difficult as I was trying to find my comfort zone and routine, especially the routine thing for me. And since adding to my routine exercise in the morning before starting, that made a huge difference to me. And now I feel like I'm actually thriving in this environment after those first 2 weeks, ever since. But I obviously don't have the same stresses and additional responsibilities that others do with children and other pets that are obviously likely to interrupt their workflow. And especially if you need long periods of thoughts, it's very difficult to get those. So
yeah, incredibly tough. And we've spoken about context switching already, but having to context switch between work and non-work stuff as well is even more difficult.
Yeah, I can imagine so. Okay, great. So a question from Daniel. You mentioned the founders helped you with coaches, external support, which you said was useful, but what happened to cause you to want/need to leave the business? Do you think it's possible to recover from a burnout while staying in the same work?
Yeah, so to answer the last question first, absolutely. I would say I've seen as many people recover and stay in the same company that they're in as I have drop out. And I think that's important to remember. You can turn it around. There is hope. And I'd say I have left companies in the past because I was approaching burnout and I didn't feel like I was getting the support I needed. I regret some of those situations. I think I probably could have stayed and turned things around with a bit more perseverance. I think in the moment when you're in the process of burning out, it's difficult to rationalize those things. But in the first role, I left because I had basically lost interest in the company and the direction they were going in, essentially. And part of that was cynicism, one of the key factors of burnout. And part of it was just that commercially they weren't really going anywhere. So it wasn't wholly related to my burnout situation, but it was a factor. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, cynicism, that's been, I think, twice in my work experience where I've had that as well, where I don't believe they're going somewhere, or I don't believe I've got, the confidence or support around me. So therefore it's better to leave and move on, if I don't feel I'm making a positive impact on the business. So, okay. So another question. So we've got, how do you deal with an employee that might blame you from their burnout and have created a HR issue from that?
Gosh, well, if you as a CTO are going through the burnout process, then causing someone, or at least having an impact on someone else who's in the burnout process as well, is quite common. It's quite frequent that you'll see that. Whether they can blame you for it, I don't think so. But that doesn't mean you can't help them with it. I think you can rationally say, I have had an effect on this person's work-related stress and their mental well-being, but you can't take complete responsibility for it. They exactly the same as you have responsibility for speaking up and for seeking out help, finding mentors, speaking to you about it. So, if it gets to the point where they burn out and then they say, well, it's his fault, then you can't really take much responsibility for that. But it's worth bearing in mind that your own burnout definitely has an impact on other people who might be prone to burning out.
Okay. So while we're still on this aspect then, so if you do recognize that a team member or an employee of yours is showing signs of burnout, because it's quite a sensitive topic, how would you go about addressing it with them? How would you identify that you're recognizing these signs?
Scientifically. So rather than going and saying, hey, how are you doing today? And, sitting opposite them and offering them a glass of water and digging into it from a psychological point of view, I think I would talk to them about specific situations where I've noticed things like communication breakdowns and disengagement and demotivation and that sort of thing, and make it specifically about things that have happened that they've been responsible for or have had some part in that relate to the burnout process, and common signs of burnout that they've displayed.
Okay.
Yeah.
How would you actually support them with this then? So you have the conversation, they go, okay, yes, I understand that I'm experiencing these signs. Would you go to them, right then, here's a therapist, here's some mentoring people. Do you literally throw it all on them? How would you try to support them with this?
No, so everyone has a different set of needs when they're burning out. So some people just want to talk it over with someone who understands, and that might not be you as their line manager. It might be someone completely different, in which case, yeah, you ask them if seeing a therapist would be useful, or if you can find a mentor who can speak to them is available. Some people need to have it from their company and from their line managers, because some people start to burn out just because they don't feel like their presence is appreciated, or that their input is appreciated, in which case it has to come from you. Yeah.
Okay, great. And this obviously highlights the need for one-on-ones with your direct team members, so you can start to spot these signs. I still see businesses that don't do that, and they do like quarterly assessments. And in those environments, you're not even touching on emotional matters. It's purely, what have you done right? What have you done wrong? Rather than anything that's much more meaningful from this standpoint.
That's it.
Okay, so a question from Chris. How do you best assess the aptitudes and soft skill behaviors of individuals in your team to help open up more honest conversations around the potential of burnout, as an example?
Ooh, interesting one. So I think probably as a team lead, you will have a gut feeling for who is more capable of talking about and opening up about these softer topics and these more personal topics, because burnout and stress are very personal things, and they're very much a function of you internalizing worries about things and worries about yourself. I think you can recognize pretty easily who's more likely to be capable of opening up, and you can give them responsibilities, I suppose, in a team setting of showing people how to be vulnerable and showing people how to open up, purely by rewarding it. So that you don't have to specifically go to them and say, hey, you're very good at being vulnerable. Can you show the rest of the team this? Can you teach that guy how to open up about his mental health problems or his well-being? That's never going to work. But you can reward it, and you can make it clear why it's being rewarded in the team setting, and show people that being open and being vulnerable isn't something that's going to be sort of looking for. It's not going to be criticized. It's not going to be it's not going to show them up. Essentially, it's going to be a positive thing that will bring about some positive change. So you can use them as exemplars. But aptitudes, I don't know. It's more attitudes, I think, than aptitudes. I don't think openness and vulnerability and willingness to speak about this kind of thing is a set of skills you can learn necessarily. It is an attitude that you can display that people can feed off from, and you can certainly do that as a leader as well. It's not just for your team to do that, and it's also a good way of building trust.
How do you reward being vulnerable?
I suppose talking about it. So talking about specific situations where someone has asked for help or or has expressed a concern that they have with a certain process, or someone being brought into the team and being vocal about the fact that it was helpful and the fact that that built a high level of trust between you and them. It's not about incentivizing it; it's about acknowledging it, I think.
Okay, great. So then, from what you've seen, do you believe that this burnout issue only exists inside the tech industry? Because I mean, we're very, up to speed with things. We're much more emotionally intelligent on the way that we work. We try to be ahead of the curve, and therefore we maybe support our staff more. So would you say this is a tech industry problem, or a problem you see elsewhere as well?
Yeah, no, it's completely universal. I'd say it's very, very much more common in the tech startup world than it is elsewhere. I think people are more inclined to walk away from roles where they're on the path to burning out in later stage companies, because they're more bureaucratic, and they understand that their impact is only as much as a cog in the system can have, essentially. But for a leader in a tech startup, you feel like the success and the well-being of the company in general is completely on your shoulders. Whether you're CTO or CMO or engineering director or finance director or whatever, there's a lot more pressure on you to get it right, especially in the period before you reach market fit, where you're just trying everything, essentially. Yeah. But no, it is a universal thing. People from every function, every walk of life suffer from burnout.
Okay. So have you seen cases of where someone has been hit hard by burnout and decides to leave the industry altogether, blaming the industry for this?
Not necessarily blaming, but certainly leaving the industry, and then moving on to later stage companies or a different function altogether. I've seen people drop out of technology, move into, in one case, I saw someone move into finance from technology because he found that to be less stressful. But I think that is, if you burn out hard enough or often enough, that is probably what you would end up doing. You'd end up finding a different way of working or a different type of work to avoid it in future.
Sure. Okay, then. So feel free to ask your questions, guys. We're coming close to the end now, so any more questions, feel free to add them. So you mentioned before that when you were first experiencing this, you were doing very long hours, not taking any breaks, which was obviously building up to this. Can people still experience burnout if they haven't had to go through that? If they've still been taking their holidays, still been working the 9-to-5s, but they still feel that burnout approach? Have you seen that? Is that still common?
I mean, it's just one factor, right? It's still pretty common to see someone burn out if they are unable to feel the benefit of what they're working on, or if they're in constant conflict with other leaders within their company, or if there are external factors as well. So if people are struggling with things outside, so conflicts with family members, or illness, or things like that, those are all factors too. But there are many factors to this that can lead to burnout.
Okay, great. One question from Jordan on the chat. As someone who has similarly been thrown into the deep end without people to learn from, do you have any tips on how to find mentors on who can help?
Well, there is this community that exists called CTO Craft, that is basically a mentoring community for leaders who are stepping up into this kind of role. So essentially, that is why CTO Craft exists. But there are always groups of CTOs within VC portfolios. For example, there are local meetups. There are quite commonly other people in their company that they can form alliances with and can speak to about this stuff. But yeah, I'd say those are the main ways.
But CTO Craft's the best, definitely.
Of course it is.
Okay, so as another thought that's just gone through my head. So if I'm a CTO of a new startup, I'm a founder, a lot of responsibilities on me, 2 or 3 developers, lots of pressure, and I'm experiencing burnout, would it be appropriate to request that you get additional funding for an interim CTO to come in and support, would you say? Would that be an acceptable case? Would you be concerned about being pushed out for this interim? I mean, what would be the thought process behind that?
I would question whether or not it's a long-term solution, and whether it actually helps you break down the patterns that you've been displaying that have led you into that burnout frame. Bringing somebody in underneath you who you can delegate more stuff to might be a more sensible thing to do, and then start to pull back a little bit and be more sensible about your energy commitments and that kind of thing. I think replacing yourself for a period of time just it feels to be a little bit like kicking the can down the road. I think it probably doesn't solve the problem.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the reason why I thought of that is there's a lot of startup businesses with CTOs that are straight out of university, very fresh. And obviously in those situations, they haven't had the opportunity to work for an experienced CTO and see how things are done and to learn from them in those cases. So that was the reason why I was thinking along that, or maybe a side role like VP of engineering where, like you say, you can delegate to and at least learn from that approach. But yeah, excellent. Okay, then. So if there's no more questions, I'm sort of coming to the end of my question list now. I know Andy's got another circle group he's going to be supporting in 15 minutes. So do you want to try and just give a roundup, Andy, of the key advice that people should be taking away?
Yeah, I think pay attention to people's communication and their ability to deal with criticism and how motivated they feel by the work that they're working on, and how engaged they are. Those are the most common things. And then by time taken off for illness reasons, and whether that's physical or emotional illness, those are the most common things that you need to look out for in others. In yourself, I think the most important thing is to remember that it is something you can pull back from. It isn't something that has to be the end of your time at that company. But the only way you can get through it is by being pragmatic about it, and by being open and honest, firstly with yourself and then with the other people in the company about how much you're struggling. And that's a really difficult first step to take. Yeah,
I can imagine. Okay, then. So thank you for your time, Andy. It's been excellent having you here. So you can contact Andy on Twitter or LinkedIn or on CTO Craft. I'll just share the details on the chat room. Our next CTO Craft Bytes session is actually a panel on Monday. So on Monday, the 15th of June at 5 p.m. It's going to be on meaningful software matrix. So I'm just going to put the link in the chat now. So I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your week and have an excellent weekend. So thank you all for joining and have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you.